Thank you very much. I'm, of course, a great honor to give this lecture, and a special thanks to Coin Lee and his colleagues who organized this great event. If you ever get invited to give a keynote, I propose that you take a subject where you are an expert, and that you don't try to improvise. And this is actually what I try to do. There was a paper which provoked me. There it is. Yeah, there. It came in my hand. It was presented at different conferences. And it was written by a group of scholars at SPRU. And when SPRU group does something, you think this must be very interesting and important. I read it and I was slightly provoked. So when I was asked to give a keynote, I thought I should speak on this topic. And of course, I realized that it was a very bad idea, because it turned out to be much more complex than I expected. So now I have a very long manuscript, which is not very well organized. But I'm going to try to take you step by step, much more quickly than in the manuscript. And I will end up, I will start by referring to the Sustainable Development Goals in the United Nations, and I will focus especially on issues about inequality and issues about climate action. I will refer to the Dutch scholars who have been the ones who have developed a lot about transition and transformation of systems. Transition and transformation is in principle about change, but it's actually referring to change of the system. So you go from one type of system to another type of system. We're going to speak more about that. And then I will say that, and that might come as a surprise, that I will say we need to go beyond national systems and introduce thinking about the transformation of the world system, where the world system is consisting of both non-components, which could be nations, but also relations between those components. I will point to the fact that investment in knowledge and extension of learning to as wide part of individuals and populations as possible is a foundation for any transformation process. I will draw lessons from the transformation of China's production and innovation system. And finally, I will end up with some critical reflections on this SPRU initiative, which provoked me to take this topic. I will come with 3 claims. I will say that there is a need to go beyond national policies and think in terms of a transformed, sustainable world system of production and innovation. And that requires a new political economic regime and new forms of international governance. Second, I will argue that the transformation of China demonstrates that emerging economies can move from unsustainable growth toward a more sustainable growth path. And I will also say that China illustrates that ambitious public investment in knowledge pays off in the long run. Finally, I will argue, with reference to this SPRU paper, that in order to develop transformative innovation policy, there is a need to draw upon a diversity of theoretical approaches to science, technology, and innovation. There is no magic bullet. So, this is what is in my rather long manuscript. So now I will try to move, go back to the sixth step. So let's start from the Sustainable Development Goals. Most of, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, they combine sustainability in three dimensions. It's about ecological sustainability, it's about economic sustainability, and it's about social sustainability. And you can say one way to illustrate that is to think in terms of income inequality as one issue and the climate change as another issue. There is an interesting difference here, because when it comes to climate change, we have actually a kind of international agreement which was made 2015 in Paris, that countries go together and each trying to do their own effort to reduce the impact on the climate. We do not have a corresponding agreement when it comes to income inequality within and between countries. And actually, if we look at the policies which are followed and the strategies, they seem actually to make this problem even worse and worse. If you look at the degree of concentration of ownership, it's very extreme, and it seems to become even more extreme over time. If you look at the literature on transition or transformation, as it has been developed by a group of scholars in Netherlands, like Frank Geels, Johan Schott, Jan Rotmans, René Kemp. So that has been mainly about ecological sustainability. The major application was an experiment in Dutch politics, where you developed a kind of program for transition of the energy system. And it lasted between 2002 and 2012. Much less in this literature and in the follow-up literature has been on sustainability when it comes to inequality at the global level between countries or inequality within countries. And if you look at the literature which has followed up, it has mainly been about the transformation of nation-specific, so-called techno-social systems. And the techno-social system is defined by a specific function in society. It can be transport, it can be energy, it can be environment. And I see a problem with that, because if we want to realize the Sustainable Development Goals as developed by in United Nations, what is really needed is not only transformation within nations, it's also a question about developing a sustainable world system. You can say that this refers to new forms of global governance. You can say the Paris Agreement in itself is a new form of global governance, because it means that the single nations have agreed to make specific contributions to reduce the impact on climate action. But my expectation is that in order to realize the sustainable development goals, you need to go much farther in this direction. It could, for instance, be that you develop policies which are truly global. You could develop a system with a global CO2 tax, where you distribute the revenue for investment in low and middle income countries with special focus on energy, and there you would have an impact both on income inequality and on global warming. And actually, Jan Fagerberg, in a recent paper, he proposed a similar idea for Europe. And he added the fact that you have more carbon-intensive production in the low-income countries within Europe than you have in the more intensive use of carbon than you have in the high-income countries. And thereby, Europe would more rapidly realize the goals. So I think this kind of new relationship between different countries would also require a different kind of economic regime in terms of moving from a system where each government tries to maximize the material welfare of their citizens under at the same time with strong market orientation and a dominance of a global financial system. That regime actually has led to an increase in inequality, and it will also make it very difficult to move regarding climate action. So I think I will now move on to actually read a little of my paper, because I think one very interesting case here is China, because you can say that if you want to look at the system which have had a major impact on the sustainability of the world in terms of both income inequality and in terms of ecological issues, China has had a very significant, both you can say first negative and perhaps also positive impact. And it will probably do so also in the future. China was an early adopter of the National Innovation System concept. The interest for the concept reflected that the Chinese leaders realized that the most fundamental weakness of the economic system was that there was no good connection between those who produced knowledge or those who used knowledge. You actually had a Soviet-type system where most knowledge production was concentrated in some institutes which were quite isolated from the production system. And the reforms initiated by Deng Xiaoping and his allies in the beginning of the 1980s. A very important part of that reform was actually to find ways to establish this connection. First, the reforms introduced combinations of private and cooperative ownership and expanded the room for market regulation. Second, they introduced decentralization, giving regions and cities a certain autonomy. Finally, these institutional changes were combined with a rapid increase in international trade, transforming China into an open economy. Of the different reforms, the move towards decentralization is perhaps the most important and also the most neglected among observers. China, in the period following, stands out not only in the extremely high rates of growth, typically between more or around 10% per year. It also stands out when it comes to growth in investment and education and research, growth rates which have been unique in the world history. It's been growing typically with 20% per annum. Today, the national rate of investment in R&D is now, as part of GNP, is now about 2%, and it's actually higher than in Europe. For many years, these efforts to build a strong national knowledge base and to develop a strong national innovation system gave limited results. The competitiveness of Chinese firms remained based upon low wage costs, and most high technology products exported from China came from foreign firms operating in China. There were few Chinese patents with global extension. As a result, China's leaders proposed a new drive toward independent innovation, aiming at increasing the domestic supply of, domestic capacity to innovate. Today, the situation looks quite different. China is number 2 after the US when it comes to the production of scientific publications and when it comes to highly cited scholarly articles. The same is true for patenting, and it is expected that China will bypass the US within the next 5 years. China has taken a lead in new fields of knowledge such as nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, and according to our friend Cohen Lee, China has actually succeeded to escape the middle income trap by leapfrogging and engaging in the production of short life cycle technologies. I would say that perhaps China is the only country in the world who took the idea of a knowledge-based and learning economy seriously. China combined massive investment in knowledge with opening up the economy. It has still unexploited potential in promoting creativity among students, democratizing work, and engaging citizens in processes of learning. But the China experience shows that ambitious and even over-ambitious investment in knowledge will have a beneficial effect in the long run. Now I need a little water. Very dry. It's okay. It's interesting to note why there is little positive experience of trickle. Now I move on to income inequality and ecological climate change. It's interesting to note that while there is little positive experience of trickle-down effects in the Western economies, the enriching of a small minority in China went hand in hand with a dramatic reduction in poverty in China. According to the World Bank, more than 500 million people were lifted out of extreme poverty as China's poverty rate fell from 88% in 1981 to 6.5% in 2012. And I think there are plans to completely get rid of poverty within the next couple of years. Between 1990 and 2005, China's progress in terms of reducing poverty accounted for more than 3/4 of global poverty reduction. Without this development, the world would not have got close even to reach the UN Millennium Development Goal of halving extreme poverty. This does not imply that China is egalitarian. Until recently, income inequality was growing, with the Gini coefficient reaching more than 50%. Only South Africa and Brazil were more unequal. Since 2010, however, inequality has been reduced, even if it remains high with the Gini coefficient about 40%. The reduction in inequality since 2010 reflects, among other factors, public policies involving massive investments in infrastructure and especially better access for peripheral regions and villages to transport systems and to ICT platforms. The access has made it possible to establish local production and create new jobs in enterprises producing products and services for the huge Chinese market. China, when it comes to the green dimension, China was slow to recognize the importance of the environmental threat. Within China, economic growth was given first priority, and there was little concern about the negative impact upon the environment. In international organizations, China representatives either denied climate change or they argued that the Western countries were responsible. But since 2011, the Chinese government has been clear in its ambitions to reduce CO2 emissions. And now a big majority of the Chinese population see global warming as a major challenge. China gave high priority to develop low carbon energy technologies already in 2008, and it has taken a world lead position in wind and solar energy technologies. More recently, around 2013, the efforts to reduce smog in the big cities by limiting the use of coal as energy source has been successful, making it less uncomfortable and dangerous to live in urban areas. China is still the single country with the highest CO2 emissions in the world, but using a combination of market and regulatory mechanisms, it has succeeded to deliver more than the promised reduction of CO2 targets set in connection with the 2015 Paris Agreement. Some experts argue that China has actually already reached the point where CO2 emissions have peaked, something which was pledged for 2030. I think this example with China raises some interesting questions. I mean, is it possible that other emerging economies will go through a similar process, starting with unsustainable growth patterns, but at some point moving out of it into more sustainable growth patterns? I raise this because the alternative view is to say we should not have growth which is not sustainable to begin with. I think we might need to think about this in a more long-term evolutionary perspective. So let me now move on to the references to this Spruing. I think actually this paper, or some version of it, will come in research policy. Is that correct? Yes. So you have a chance. I mean, you can find it easily on the net, but it will also appear. I don't know if it is exactly the version I have read, or if it's a different one. What they say in this paper is that they look at the three successive framings of innovation policy. The first one is basically, I would say, the linear model. They call it innovation for growth. And it starts immediately after the war. And then they say comes in the 1980s, something they call the national systems of innovation framing. And now comes a new framing, which they refer to as Innovation Policy 3.0. The idea with the new one is that it's much better than the other ones because they focus on non-economic objectives and they have a different idea of policy. It shouldn't all be about the state, it should be also more experimental, and it should keep all kinds of options open. The paper is programmatic and brief. It has a simple structure and a clear message that reflects the title. At the core of the new transformative change framing are concepts with roots in the Dutch SPS community, which I referred to very briefly earlier, such as socio-technical system and multidimensional perspective. It should be noted that Gale already in 2004 in an article in Research Policy presented the concept socio-technical system as an alternative to the concepts sectoral innovation system and technological innovation system. Frankly, you remember that. And in the new SPRU initiative, it is presented as an alternative also to the concept national innovation system. Two major reasons are given for why this perspective is to be preferred. One is that the SDI concepts focus on non-economic outcomes, and they indicate different methods when it comes to develop and implement policy. One problem with the criticism of the earlier versions is that they criticize the policies which have been pursued in the name of these framings rather than the theoretical background. And it makes a difference, as I've written in the postscript to the '92 book on national innovation systems, the transfer of the concept from scholarly work into policy transforms it, and I would even say distorts the concepts in a different way. When it comes to the new framing, they don't have this problem because it's still at an experimental stage. There is no policy, so they they compare actually some policies which is pursued in the name of some framings with some ideal theoretical framing. One exception is the experiment I mentioned in Netherlands, where the government introduced a program referred to as transition management in 2002. The trial lasted actually to 2011. This unique experience applying the transition ideas is not, as far as I could see, even mentioned in the Sprue document. And the second paper, which I mentioned here, which is an attempt to compare different policy initiatives, actually confirms that transformational framing remains marginal and at an experimental stage. I think the new initiative, it's interesting and timely, and I think it's good to raise the issues about the necessity of a transformation of systems, production innovation systems, in the light of global challenges. But the good intentions and ideas, I think, are undermined by the attempt to promote specific concepts such as socio-technical systems and multi-level perspective, and by misrepresenting the literature on innovation systems. The central concepts referred to, socio-technical system and multi-level perspectives, are useful for understanding some aspects of transformation of innovation systems, but like the different versions of innovation systems, national, regional, sectoral, technological, they are focusing devices, which means that they leave important aspects of the transformation outside the focus. Socio-technical systems, as I mentioned before, refers to subsystems within nation states, and the concepts have been developed in the context of small, high-income countries. While they go far in the discussion of how citizens and stakeholders can get engaged in policy formulation, they have very little or nothing to say about the importance of work, workplace innovation, and workers' participation in change. They have also very little to say about the role of professional users in the sphere of industrial production. For me, it's obvious that in order to move the world towards sustainability, and here I include both the income inequality and the ecological dimension. In order to do that, there's a need to combine the three framings for innovation policy. Transformation will require developing new technology through the support of science. This is almost innovation for growth. There will be a need to link science to engineering and industrial users. This requires an innovation system framing. And transforming in techno-economic systems will also contribute to the transformation to a sustainable world system. But I would say that all the three framings need to be further developed in order to take into account the current degree of global interdependence. National strategies for investments in science need to consider what is going on in science systems abroad and take into account the potential for international collaboration. Strategies to build a strong national innovation system need to be combined with a strategy for the openness of the system. The transformation of socio-technical system will require the use of foreign technologies, and while some may become more localized, others will become international. In order to link the transformation of national systems to the transformation of a world system of production and innovation, we can draw upon literatures which exist. Literatures on innovation networks, literatures on global production networks, and literatures on global value chain. I think it's a bad idea, and it's not very Spru-like, actually, because I thought Spru always was a place for coexistence between many different approaches. I think it's a bad idea to argue that there's only one framing that takes us towards a transformed world system. There is a strong argument for diversity or for avoiding lock-in. We need to apply different concepts and use different tools. And here I actually agree with René Kemp, who is one of the major contributors to this literature. On his homepage, he makes the following statement. I'm a critical methodological pluralist. I think that all methods and theoretical perspectives have value. Unfortunately, scientists too often fall victim to their own assumptions and constraints of their own methods. Thank you very much.